It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Paige and I am the Program Coordinator of Prison Fellowship in Queensland. If you have never heard of Prison Fellowship before, we run a bunch of amazing programs both in and outside of prison. We started in the 80s by a man named Chuck Colson, who is affectionately referred to as President Nixon's hatchet man. And he was wrapped up in a little scandal called Watergate. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but he was really complicit in what happened in that time. And so during the investigation, he had an encounter with the Lord and became a Christian. And so because of that, his life was radically transformed. And he felt a burden on his heart to confess to his part in Watergate, and so he went to the prosecution and confessed to his part in the crime, and that landed him in prison for a period of 8 months. And he tells this story about receiving his prison uniform, and he gets handed a pair of underwear that had 5 previous inmate numbers crossed out, and he was the 6th person to wear that pair of underwear. And in that moment, he talks about the complete shame he felt and the lack of human dignity, and realized the weight and the consequences of the choices he made. And so during that period of time, he saw an opportunity in prison to minister to these men that he was serving alongside. He realized in that space that they were just men like him, and all of them had made the wrong choice and landed them in a pretty bad situation. And even though he might have come from the White House, that they were all actually just the same. All just men. And so he loved them. He started Bible studies and things like that. And once he left prison, he did still feel that burden on his heart to remember those that were incarcerated. And so that is how Prison Fellowship was born. We have been running programs since then. We run a program called The Prisoner's Journey, in which we introduce the Gospel of Mark to prisoners. We let them know who Jesus is, and they get to make a decision about who he is and who he could be to them. And so that's a great journey that we program that we journey with them through. We also run an incredible program called the Sycamore Tree Project, and in that we take in victims of crime, and they're able to share their stories in prison with these prisoners. And for people that have been subject to really horrifying things at the hand of somebody else, that for people that have been carrying a burden of shame or a heaviness or a weight around being a victim of crime, you know, they come into this space where they're sharing their testimonies and their stories in a way that's empowering transformation in somebody else. And these prisoners have an opportunity to see that their actions have consequences, and that there's people on the other side of these stories. It's not just their life that has been affected or their family's life that has been affected by their choices, but there's a ripple effect that continues to impact and change the lives of other people. And so it's a really powerful program, and I always get so overwhelmed to hear the testimonies and the stories of that place and what happens in that space, and just to hear how the victims are able to journey through forgiveness and allow them to connect with these people that do have a common thread of crime, and on opposite sides of the story, but in the same story nonetheless. And so it's really powerful that we get to do that. We run Change on the Inside, which is a character-based program. We talk about the character of having integrity, about what it means to be somebody who really carries themselves well, and that's a great program also that we get to journey with them. We also run an incredible program called Extraordinary Lives, and that is work with kids with incarcerated parents. We often find that kids are the lost and forgotten victims of crime. They're the ones that can be left behind by the choices made by their families. And so in that space, we do mentoring, we do education support, we do camps for kids, and Angel Tree. Kids with incarcerated parents are 6 to 7 times more likely to end up in prison themselves. I was speaking to a pastor friend of mine who was having a conversation with a 7-year-old boy, and this 7-year-old boy said, "When I grow up and go to prison, I'm going to be an artist." At the age of 7, this boy had decided that his legacy was prison, because his dad was in prison and his uncle was in prison, and he didn't know that there was a different path or journey that he could walk. And so that's what we really aim to do in that space of extraordinary lives, is just intercept and be able to start to speak a different story, one that God might speak over us, one that declares that they have a purpose and a destiny and a different choice, a different way that can be paved for them, that, you know, they too can become children of God and live a different story. And so it's really powerful work that happens. Angel Tree is something that Pastor Andre has put his hand up for this church to participate in this year. Angel Tree also started in the 80s by a woman named Mary Kay Beard. She was a notorious bank robber, and she landed herself in prison. And in that space, God did what he does best and totally captured her heart. And she also gave her life to Christ and said, God, whatever it is that you want me to do, I will do it. And so she saw at Christmas time these women that she was serving time alongside of, wrapping up soap, little bottles of shampoo and conditioner and toiletries that had been donated by charity groups to these prisoners and inmates, and wrapping them up for their children for Christmas, because it's the only thing that they had to give them. And when she left prison, that stayed with her, that haunted her memories a little bit. And so part of the work that she did was in starting Angel Tree, where we join with local churches such as yourself, and every year in Queensland deliver up to 3,500 gifts to kids on behalf of their parents behind bars. Again, it's a really amazing opportunity to connect with these communities and these families in different ways that might be neighbours, they might just be a few streets away from where you're living, and to be able to let them know that they're loved, that they're not lost, that they're not forgotten, that somebody thinks of them, and there's people here that pray for them and support them and love them. And so you'll have an opportunity to get involved in Angel Tree this year, whether or not that be through donating, whether or not that's purchasing presents or being part of the delivery of that. But I'm sure Pastor Andre would love to let you know how you can be part of that program that's running here. It's really incredible and powerful work. And before we get into the word, maybe this morning you're thinking about how you can get involved in this awesome ministry. And maybe as you're listening this morning to the message, or something might settle in your heart that you might feel a burden to be involved. And there's heaps of ways to be able to do that. The first and probably most important thing that every single person in this room can do is pray. You know, we send out every single Sunday morning, I send out a prayer diary that has real life situations that are happening. People are sending us in things, chaplains. We have people going into prisons every single week, and we're praying for the centres, we're praying for the chaplains, we're praying for the prisoners. And so prayer is something that's really integral in this ministry, and we would love to have you partner with us in that way. You can also become a volunteer. Maybe you are one of those people that feels a burden on their heart to be able to go and be part of these programs. Maybe you yourself are a victim of crime and feel like you could use your story in that way to transform somebody else's life. And, you know, we would love to have you be a part of that. We have an information session coming up on Monday night online that gives a bit more information about our ministry and how you can be involved. So if that's something that you're interested in, we would love to have you as well. You can come and grab a red card off me after service. We'll have it just in that centre bit that you can just pop your name and your email, and we can send you information about volunteering, or just add you to our prayer diary so you know what's happening in our ministry and you can be involved that way. The final way that you can be involved is if you do feel a burden on your heart to give financially. For $15 a month, you can change the lives of 3 prisoners or their family members, and that also can be done by just filling out one of these red cards after service. Maybe local missions is not for you, and that's okay, but you have been blessed with an abundance of finance in that way you think you could make a difference. So there's heaps and heaps of ways that you can get involved, but I'll hang around after the service, so please do come and speak with me. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. I'd love to have a conversation with you, get to know your story as well. I promise I don't bite. I'm very friendly and I would love to meet you, so please don't feel afraid to come and speak to me afterwards. Right, so we are kicking off a series. I heard that I was the first one, which makes me a little bit nervous. But I heard that we are starting a series here called Haunted. And when I started thinking about this idea of haunted, being haunted by your past or by your regret. And I was wondering how I might be able to share best about maybe how our ministry is out working in this space, or how people might be impacted by what we do and what the word says in our space. I had a conversation with an ex-inmate that's involved in our ministry, and I asked her, what was the most haunting thing about your time in prison? And she said it was not being there for her son. She said, the time that she'd spent behind bars, that separation of knowing that there was going to be a period of time where she was not going to be with her son. And they, on his birthday, went into lockdown, and so she wasn't even able to call him. And kids don't always understand why they're not receiving a call from their parent, and for her that was a hard thing to know, that the reason she couldn't connect with her child is because of the choices that she'd made. And I was just speaking to a woman in prison the other day, and she sat down with tears in her eyes, and she said, I have been in here for 4 months, and I saw my daughter for the first time, and she was so overwhelmed by just the change that had taken place in 4 months in her daughter, like seeing her daughter 4 months on, being so, hit by the fact that she'd grown so much just in 4 months. And for her, that was the realization that she never wanted to be in that situation or scenario again. She never wanted to be in a place where she would be separated from her daughter. And so I wanted to talk to you this morning about this concept of being haunted by time. We all have it. Some of us might feel like we have all the time in the world. Others might be more aware of the number of days we have left, or the measure by which we've been given. But it is something that we all have. And even when life doesn't go exactly as planned, it's certainly something that can become an enemy. There's a saying that says time heals all wounds, but time itself doesn't actually sort out all of our problems. It's the process of living inside the opportunities it gives us and letting the journey we're on change us. And I want to look at one story in particular in the Bible today that I think of often when it comes to this concept of captured time. And that is in Genesis 40. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. That is the story of Joseph. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you because time, but I do want to recap a little bit just in case you're not familiar with what's happening in this story where we pick it up. But we're introduced to Joseph in Genesis chapter 37, where it starts talking about Joseph at 17 was gifted a tunic from his father because he was the favourite. I don't know if you have siblings or you've ever experienced a moment like that where a parent has favoured one or the other, but that really stings. And so his brothers were not huge fans. They were not at all happy about what was happening, that he had been openly named as the favourite and given this really beautiful gift by Jacob. And so it says his brothers hated him. They were so angry with him. And then to really add fuel to the fire, Joseph has this dream where the interpretation is pretty much that his brothers and his parents are going to bow down to him. And already there's not a lot of favour there in the family for Joseph. And so everybody is not very receptive to that. That does not stir up any enthusiasm in any single person that hears that. And yet it's the dream that he has. And one day his brothers are working off in a field, and Joseph's father Jacob says, go and check on them, make sure they're doing okay and see where they're up to. So he goes out into the field, and as the brothers see him approaching, they start to plan to kill him. And one of the brothers has mercy and says, let's not kill him, let's instead throw him into a pit. And his plan was to go back later and rescue him and take him back to the father. But in a moment where he was getting lunch, one of the brothers said, let's not leave him in this pit. Let's instead sell him into slavery. And so Joseph ends up sold into slavery and lands himself in Potiphar's house, so who is in service to Pharaoh. And in that place, it says God was with him and everything he did prospered. Apparently he was a little bit too good looking. No, that's what the Bible tells us. He was a very good looking man, too good looking, because the wife started to lust after Joseph and tried to seduce him into a relationship he should not have been in. But Joseph, being the upstanding person that he was, declined. And she took his tunic and then fabricated a story that he tried to force himself upon her. So he finds himself in prison. And that is where we find in Genesis 40. And I'm just going to read this. It came to pass that after these things, so he'd been in prison, he'd now been promoted to a place of honour in the prison. He was pretty much looking after inmates and things like that. And for however long that period of time was. Genesis 40, it came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, and chief butler and chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison and place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. So they were in custody for a while. I just love that, he served them. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them, and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And so Joseph said, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream was a vine before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was though it budded, its blossom shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." And Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon." And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head." And so Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you." And now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all of his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So Joseph interprets the dreams of these 2 prisoners that are in the prison at the same time, and he notices they're sad, and he asks them what's wrong, and he has this opportunity to share a word from God with them. And the cupbearer was indeed restored to the Pharaoh's service, and when Joseph says, "Please remember me," it's 2 years. It says after that, it came to pass at the end of 2 full years. So even after that encounter where they're having this conversation and Joseph's able to encourage this cupbearer and let him know that he's going to be restored to his service, that he's totally forgotten and left in this place for 2 more years. And Joseph was able to go into a place afterwards where he's interpreted this dream of the Pharaoh, and it took a while. And Joseph had been given a dream a few years prior, and him in his heart surely was thinking, he's been given this image, this word, this dream, that he's going to be in a position where his family are bowing down to him, and instead he finds himself in captivity. Instead, he finds himself sold off into slavery, and then he finds himself in prison for this long period of time, even after he has a moment where he thinks, maybe this could be my restoration. It's another 2 years of time. And I might not be as holy or wholesome as some people in this room, because if I was in that position, I'd be quite upset. I think I'd be frustrated with God. I might be angry that what I thought was going to come to pass isn't. And finding myself instead in this season of captivity where time is the prison, I would be mad. And I wonder why God chose to share this part of the story in the Word, considering the entire time that Joseph spent in prison. Why this part? Why is this part important? And I wonder if it's because in the entirety of Joseph's stay in prison, that this particular story might give us hope that the most unexpected seasons of captivity, or a situation in which we might be tempted to just bide our time, that God instead could be doing something that's necessary for what comes next. Perhaps this journey was not something that Joseph just had to wait out or get through, but something that created in Joseph the ability to carry what was to come. These interpreted dreams were the very opportunity that God used for him to be able to meet with Pharaoh. That his dreams and these conversations with these men in prison were the very thing that God used to propel him further into this place. And by the grace and mercy of God, he was able to interpret this dream for Pharaoh. And as you read on in the story, which we won't do this morning, but you can do in your own time. But as you continue to read on in the story, spoiler alert, he does eventually find the world opened up to him again, and does end up back in this position where essentially his dream that he had before does in fact come to pass. And it's difficult for me to draw comparisons to the life of Joseph in prison and prisoners, because the stories are totally different. You know, Joseph actually did nothing wrong. He didn't commit a crime. He didn't do what he was accused of doing. And that's not necessarily the case for people that are behind bars. But this story does remind me that even in prison, God can be working. Chuck Colson, when speaking on his time in prison, said, "I wouldn't have made it if I didn't have a belief in the back of my mind that God had a purpose for this." Believing in the purpose of God in those long days of just biding time gave him hope for a future that he could have outside, a future that he could have beyond prison. You know, we recently had an art exhibition in Queensland in which inmates across Queensland submitted artworks under the theme of redemption. And I was really overwhelmed by some of the submissions. And I did bring a couple for us to have a look at this morning. So this one, I'll read it for you. This was submitted by a mother. It says, "I wake up in a room that feels like home, but come to realization there is nowhere to roam. As the clocks keep ticking, it's home I'm really missing. As the months roll into another, I'm so grateful for my mother. The seconds pass and turn into days. For me, life is on hold. But outside, it still unfolds. The punishment is not the jail. It's the missed out family time. But I have to say I'm fine, because in here, it hurts to feel. And you definitely know the pain is real. Restless nights in a bed so far away, always feeling alone each and every day. All I have are pictures on a wall and a pillow to hug me to make me feel all right. The end seems so far, and yet I can't lose sight. Each day is a day done of this hard time. I tell myself that to get to sleep at night, I dream of my family and pretend I'm hugging them tight." It's just such a heartbreaking story, because for that person, time is their biggest prison. It's the time that they're spending in a place that they didn't really anticipate or understand they might come to. And knowing that for them, they're in this place where they have to stand still and wait and the world outside keeps on turning. Time is their prison. There's this other one that I was really touched by. It says, what if? It's a very complex diorama. There's a lot in there. I'll read what the piece of paper in the front says to you. What if you lost control of yourself through death of a loved one, drugs, gambling, money, or jail, losing all hope and faith to hitting rock bottom? We find ourselves praying to God and asking for help and to guide us in the right direction, because the unfortunate path we took takes us away from our kids, family, friends, and life itself. Hoping our sorries to our loved ones and the victims we brought into our destructive path are accepted. When everyone doubts you, you believe in yourself and know forgiving yourself is the first step through our difficult time, searching for the sun to brighter days, to success, freedom, and redemption. And when I looked at that, I was so impacted by it. And then the title of the piece is, what if it took hitting rock bottom to see the sun? And that is a story I hear often. It's a story I hear quite often in prison. That people only in realizing the depravity of their situation, the guilt and the shame and the turmoil of their wrong decisions, in their regrets, can make a decision that this is not a life they're willing to live anymore. What if these desperate situations in our own lives are the very things enlarging our capacity to live in the fullness of the gospel of Jesus? Because that is the gospel story, is it not? That we, lost in our sin, needed the grace and mercy of a Saviour, and because he chose not to let us go in our depravity, but instead laid down his life for us so that we might know a redeemed and a restored life. Psalm 139 says, your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. Time is a gift, and if each day of our lives is already written and determined in the book, each and every single one of those days holds purpose. I love that Jeremiah 29:11 is on the wall because it's in my notes for this morning too. It says, for I know the thoughts that I think towards you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. And if God has plans for us, I wonder if we might be bold enough to accept that, like Joseph, even though our situations or our circumstances might not be the most ideal place or the place that we desire to be in, that even those days have purpose, that even those moments hold some ability for us to know God in a better way. It says in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to this purpose. Maybe that very season that to you looks like a prison season, or where time is haunting you, you feel like maybe it's a situation of bankruptcy or a medical diagnosis or the illness of a loved one, and for you it feels like the days are spent waiting to get over the bad times. I know certainly in my own life I have had those days and those months, and they drag on and they're tiresome. But maybe that very season is the thing that's going to turn things around for you, the very thing that God might use to capture your attention. Psalm 27:14 says, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. You know, the word wait here in Hebrew is interpreted as twisting together. I think sometimes we can think of this concept of waiting as tapping our foot and watching the clock as the hands tick around. But this gives us a bit of a different perspective, that perhaps waiting is instead an invitation to twist ourselves together with God, to entwine ourselves with God, and to trust that in these moments, that though they might be desolate to us, are things that God can use for his purposes. I have one final image, and this is a window that has been broken. As you can see, there's a hole in the window and it's knocked off a vase. Flowers are going everywhere. And in the corner is a ball. And that ball says redemption. What a powerful image. Because I would not associate a picture like that with the idea of redemption. But perhaps in the understanding of the disruption of God in our lives is his mercy. Maybe it's an invitation to the depths of Christ to know him in more intimate ways. And it might be messy, but God's never been afraid of that. And if you find yourselves in one of these seasons of life where you feel haunted by time, may this be something that forms the very fabric of God's demonstration of love for you. And I pray that you might find comfort in knowing, no matter the situation, God can turn it around. And I pray that by his mercy, for you, just like these prisoners that have encountered his love and mercy, I pray that for you, he does. We're going to sing one last song together, so I'd like to invite the worship team back.